Hello, scholars, and welcome to another exciting screencast in U.S. history. Today we'll be talking about Indian removal from our textbook, Chapter 10, Section 4. By the end of this section, you should be able to tell someone why Jackson used force to remove Native Americans from the Southeast. As always, here are our section objectives. If you cannot accomplish these by the end of the screencast, you must either ask a peer for help, rewatch or reread the screencast, read the section, schedule a conference with me, or figure it out. Our section objectives are: describe the culture of Native Americans in the Southeast, describe the conflict over land occupied by Native Americans in the Southeast, and discuss the forced removal of Native Americans. Describe the culture of Native Americans in the Southeast. So, when Andrew Jackson became president, there are more than 100,000 Native Americans still living east of the Mississippi River. Many were farmers or lived in towns. These included tribes like the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and the Creek Nations, and they all live in parts of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. There were the Seminoles who lived in Florida, but they had an unusual origin. They were a combination of Creeks who had moved into Florida, native Florida Native Americans, and escaped African American slaves. The Cherokee adopted some white customs or customs of the settlers from Europe. So aside from farming, they ran successful businesses such as grain and lumber mills. Many of them could speak and read English, and many converted to Christianity. The Cherokees developed a written alphabet for their language. It was created by a learned leader named Sequoyah. In 1827, the Cherokees established a government based on a written constitution, and they claimed status as a separate nation. The next year, they even started a newspaper in both English and Cherokee. Well, that one was easy. Here's our first summary slide. If you do not have this yet, my recommendation would be to pause, copy these down, and then continue. If you have it, let's continue though. Second objective, describe the culture of Native Americans in the Southeast. So the government leaders of the United States kind of believe the presence of Native Americans in the Southeast is what's stopping the United States from expanding westward. Also, greedily, the Native Americans lived on fertile land, so white farmers wanted that land for growing their own cotton, for making more money for themselves. There have been policies to move Native Americans from the land all the way dating back to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson hoped that they would move eventually on their own, and he really believed this is the only way to preserve their Native American culture. But after the War of 1812, the federal government signs treaties with several Native American groups from the old Northwest. Under these treaties, the groups gave up their land and moved west of the Mississippi River. The Native Americans of the Southeast were a little more stubborn. They didn't want to move. In 1825, President James Monroe suggests a plan to move all the Native Americans living east of the Mississippi River to land west of the river, but nothing comes of it yet. So years are going by, and there's more and more pressure being put on the Native Americans of the Southeast. So by the 1820s, many white Southerners are demanding that Native Americans be removed by force. In 1825 and 1827, the state of Georgia passes laws that force the Creeks to give up most of their land. In 1828, Georgia tried to do the same thing to the Cherokees. The state said that Cherokees were not a separate nation, and they had to move off their land. They do get a little bit of support, the Native Americans, that is. So Georgia's actions actually get challenged in two cases that reached the Supreme Court. The first was Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831. And in that, the court did refuse to stop Georgia from enforcing its laws. They said Georgia can do this. But in the second case, which is Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, the court declared that Georgia's laws can have no force within Cherokee territory, that they are a separate nation. So the laws of the state of Georgia do not apply to them. The Chief Justice, or the head judge of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, wrote the majority opinion on Worcester versus Georgia. He just kind of wrote the rationale for why they decided that particular outcome. So he quotes the treaties that the United States had signed, guaranteeing certain territory to Native Americans. And he says, under the Constitution, treaties are the supreme law of the land. Therefore, Marshall said, Georgia had no say over Cherokee territory. President Jackson comes along, and he's kind of like Georgia. He really wants to move the Native Americans from their land. He's pretty furious about the ruling in Worcester versus Georgia. He is quoted saying, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So technically it is the role of the executive branch to enforce the laws or enforce the will that is carried out by the legislative and judicial branches, but he didn't really feel like doing that. So at the time, Jackson actually was already putting a federal law into play called the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Guess what it did? The law gave him the authority to offer Native American nations land west of the Mississippi in exchange for their land in the east, and it provided money to be able to do that. Again, here's our summary slide. If you have not yet written, which I would recommend, pause. Either write this word for word or summarize. If you're ready, though, you may continue on with me. All right, our final objective is to discuss the forced removal of Native Americans. Now, this is a pretty dark part of our history as a nation. We don't like to talk about it very much because we are typically thought of as the land of the free, home of the brave, yada, yada, yada. But we have some dark parts of our past. So let's look at one. So Native Americans believe they don't really have much of a choice, and they believe they're eventually going to have to give up their land. So some do. They sign treaties. They agree to move to what is now, or what was called the Indian Territory. Most of that land is now called Oklahoma. The Choctaws are the first to move. They signed their first treaty in 1830. It's called the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, and it stated that, quote, the United States, under a grant, shall cause to be conveyed to the Choctaw Nation a tract of country west of the Mississippi River. So as they're moved from their land out east to the Indian Territory, the Choctaws are closely guarded by American soldiers, and the move west takes place between 1831 and 1833. So it took place over a long period of time. The federal government didn't provide enough tents, food, blankets, shoes, winter clothes, and other supplies. It rained heavily, and it snowed, and it caused enormous suffering. An Army lieutenant wrote that one group, quote, walked for 24 hours barefoot through the snow and ice before reaching shelter. So, the Cherokees are probably the most in-your-face example of how awful this forced removal was. And the Cherokees were able to hold out for a little while. Remember that the Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830. They were still on their lands in 1837 when Andrew Jackson left office. But in 1838, the next president, Martin Van Buren, forced the Cherokees to move. So in the winter of 1838 to 1839, they went to the Indian Territory, guarded by 7,000 U.S. soldiers. We call this route today the Trail of Tears. Here's one soldier's description, and hopefully it will help you understand a little bit more why. So on the morning of November 17th, we encountered a terrific sleet and snowstorm with freezing temperatures, and from that day until we reached the end of the fateful journey on March the 26th, 1839, the suffering of the Cherokee were awful. The trail of the exiles was a trail of death. The Cherokees were forced to march hundreds of miles with little food and shelter. Many didn't survive, so 15,000 left, 11,000 got there. 4,000 people died along the way. The last group to move was the Seminole Indians. They fought. They didn't want to move. They fought 3 wars against removal. But in the 1840s, most of the Seminoles were eventually forced to move. So in these new homes in the Indian Territory, Native Americans really struggled to rebuild their lives after these horrible conditions. Some of them do, some of them don't. This is our final summary slide. Make sure that you have gotten all your notes. I would recommend going back and looking at the 3 summary slides just to double check. If you cannot accomplish any of the 3 section objectives or cannot answer that original question I posed to you in the beginning by this point, go back, rewatch the video, ask a friend, schedule a conference with me. Do what you got to do. Thank you, scholars. Have a lovely day.